Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to the fourth installment of my video series on data manipulation and data analysis using R. So if you tuned in to my third session, these two topics at the top were the basic topics that were covered. So we looked at data types at a very high level, and specifically we looked at numbers, factors, and character type data columns or fields, whatever you want to reference them as. Um, and we also talked about how to create and reference a specific column using the dollar sign. In today's video, I want to go over these next three topics here. So basically how to index and subset a data set, and I'll briefly go over what those terms are, how to merge data files, specifically what we'll be talking about in this video here is how to merge datasets column wise, and I'll explain what that means as well. And then finally, we'll be exporting an object. So this video might be slightly longer than the others. We'll see how long it takes, but I do want to cover all three of these topics in this video. So we'll see how long that goes. So anyway, okay, real quick though, I want to go over some of the old stuff that we ran here. If if you want to actually get rid of some of your objects that you have for whatever reason, or if you want to get rid of all of them, actually you can click this little object up here, which is kind of a broomstick when you get it cleaned up. So let's just go ahead and get rid of these just to see what happens. So we can see the objects aren't there anymore. But the great thing about using a scripting language like R is that you could simply rerun your code and we can create those objects again, no problem. So, compared to something like Excel, if you were to, create columns and move them around and then use some logic, it may not be easy to check, how did I create this value? Can I do this again? What was my flow of work? It'd be probably more difficult and more time consuming to replicate, if you compare to using something like this in R where you can simply, oh, I'll just run my code again. Um, so that's one of the benefits of working with a scripting language like R is that you can really easily replicate that work and then you can track step by step. Okay, this is what happened here. This is what happened here. Hopefully, if you wrote your code, fairly procedurally and cleanly enough. So, another thing I wanted to comment on real quick is I understand like this is kind of cut off on the side, so I do apologize about that. This recording software makes it a little tricky for me to zoom in and zoom out all the time, so I just kind of keep it at the static, um, uh, you know, zoom in spot here. So I do apologize if it does get cut off from time to time, but I'll try to keep an eye on it so that it all sticks in and it is a decent size. The font's easy to read. So anyway, those are my main concerns with that. But all right, cool. So let's go ahead and examine our data here that we have. And so we made an object a while back, and then we also created a column called baseball. And so everyone's favorite hobby in that data set was baseball. Um, but anyway, so let's go into some of the basics of indexing and subsetting. So let's actually create an object that isn't a data frame. So that's the type of object that we've been working with so far. There's actually multiple types of objects in R, but for practical reasons, I just wanted to introduce that first object first of data frame because it's very likely that if you're working with the data set, you're kind of your standard where you have one row for an observation and then the names of your columns and fields up here. You're probably going to be working with the data frame for the most part. So I like to start with that first before introducing some other data objects. But a really simple one is actually if we were to just simply store an object called uh, hello world, and we want it just to have this text hello world, we could do that. So we can see here that we have an object now called hello world, and it stores the string. called hello world. And if we want, to check what it has, it's got hello world in there. So, this is just a simple object, the vector, if you will. Let's try typing. Let's see what that says. So it's a character type. Yeah, this is just a simple object that has the word hello world. But let's say, for instance, we want to create um, something that has multiple elements to it. So you can kind of think of this hello world object as simply having one element, just this one, string of values within these parentheses. But let's say, for instance, we wanted to do something like create a grocery list. So we'll do that. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to create an object called grocery list, and I'm going to use a feature that we haven't seen yet, which is just a C. You can kind of think of that as concatenate almost. Here's a way to combine multiple elements in one. So, simply C and then parentheses. But let's actually put in a few things here. So let's say we want bread, and then let's say we want eggs. And then third, we'll want milk. All right, I think that's pretty standard grocery list. So we'll create that object now, and if we want to view it, we can just run it, and we can see we've got these three elements, right, in here. And so instead of just one object earlier, like when we had hello world, we actually have three now. We have bread, eggs, and milk. So anytime you have an object like this that has actually multiple items in there, the position of these items can actually be important. So for instance, what I mean by that is, what if I wanted to, for whatever reason, access the second element in this grocery list? And in this case, it would be eggs, right? So I can actually do that by looking at its index value, or basically its position within this list. So that's basically what an index value is its position in some type of iterable, to be fancy. But in this case, you can see, obviously I made this very simple, but eggs comes second in this list of things. So 2 would actually be its index value. So if you've actually had some background in other coding languages before, I'm guessing you may have maybe or maybe not, come across. Well, if you have come across another language where you want an index like Python, and that first element is actually the index value actually starts with 0. But in this case, in R, that first element starts with 1. So sorry to confuse there, but let's just go ahead and let's create a new element here called eggs. So what if we want to create an object that stores eggs from this grocery list? So simply put, one way to do this would be to pull up that iterable, or that list that we created already. And then we can actually access that element of eggs by using the bracket and then its index value. So let's go ahead and try to run that. And then if we click on our eggs, or if we run our eggs object here, we can see eggs. So Houston, we have eggs. So this is, it seems like a fairly simple enough concept, and it is, but it's quite important in a lot of coding languages is referencing an object based off of its position or its index value within some type of iterable or a list. So, um, so in this case, we had something very simple here, just uh, three basic elements. We had bread, eggs, and milk, and an object. But this whole concept of indexing can also be used when we're talking about something like this, like a data set. So the main difference, though, between something like we had here, uh, bread, eggs, and milk, versus something like this, is that we have, kind of like basically another dimension to worry about. So instead of just just one dimension. We actually have to worry about rows and columns. So as you can imagine, if you're indexing a data set like this example data, and you want to reference a specific row or a specific column or a specific cell, you probably want to use two numbers because you'll be referencing not only its row, but you'll also be referencing its column. So earlier when we were using the $sign, we were actually basically indexing in a way, but we were using the name of the column to index. But in this case, we can also uh, create or we can reference a column based off of its value. So, all right, let's see what that would look like. So let's say, for instance, I want to create a new object and I want it to store um, this value of engineer. So the way that would work, it would look something like this. So I'm going to create a new object called engineer, and I'm going to reference this example data, and then I'll use the brackets again. Except in this case, like I mentioned previously, we'll be supplying two values now. So the first value that you supply will be the row that you're talking about or you want to access. And then the second value will be the column. So if we actually go back and view our data set, you can see that these rows are actually numbered. So these are the row names or the row index values. So if we were to access this whole row, it would be whole row 1 and then row 2 and so on. And the same goes for the columns. So the first column would be column 1 and then the second column would be column 2. So what do you think it would look like if we wanted to access engineer? So it would be the second row and the third column. And even if you hover your mouse over the column name, you can see that it has the column number on there. So you say column 2 and then column 3. So if we were to run this, let's clear this just so that it's easier to read. And then hopefully if we run it, yes. So it does list off the other kind of unique values in there, but we do see that we have indeed accessed engineer by using kind of this two value indexing here. So let's do some other stuff here. So as I mentioned, let's create another object, first row of data. So what would this look like? So instead of actually referencing a column, in this case, what we would do is leave that value blank. So again, we would list that first value, the one, but then we'd have a comma followed by actually basically nothing, and then the close bracket. So what this is telling R now is give me that first row and then all of the columns for that first row. So let's see. And if we run our first row of data here, that's what we have. So we can see we have the unique ID, we have John Smith, the carpenter, and John Smith likes baseball. So let's get the third row, the third column here. So basically you want carpenter, engineer, and missing value, but we don't want any other column. So similarly, we'll create a new object here, third column in data set, and then do example data, and then 3. So similarly, we'll put in the comma, but then we won't put any values in the front of it because we want to say, hey, give me all of those rows, but then give me only the third column. So if we run this, we can see, yep, so we do have the carpenter, engineer, and the missing value. So the carpenter, engineer, missing value. So that is a quick crash course on indexing, a data set, and even other like simple things like something as simple as a grocery list if we want one item or two items from that. We can also do a little more though. Let's say if we want to access not only just one column or one row, Let's do a range of values or a range of rows. So let's say, for instance, I want unique ID. So row one, I don't really care for John Smith's name, but I do want carpenter and baseball. So what would that look like? So now I'll show you. Carpenter and baseball. And then what we'll do is we'll reference our data set again. And then we want all of that first row, but in this case, we we want that first row because we'll be taking this row here, but we don't want John Smith, so we'll actually take columns 2 through 3. And one way to do that is to actually put in the colon like this. So this says, give me that first row, and then give me all of columns 2 through 3. So if you want to specify a range, you can do that with a colon, a colon. And this also works with the rows as well. But let's just run this and see. Let's see what we got here. It's getting low there. So, oh, oh, sorry. We actually want 3 and 4. Haha. I did 2 and 3. Okay. So now we have carpenter and baseball. So the colon is just a way to specify a range as opposed to just one value. You can give it multiple, and that also goes for the rows as well. Okay, so spent a good amount of time on some of the basics of indexing here. Let's see what else I had on my list. Okay, great. So the next thing I want to talk about is how to merge two or potentially more data files or data sets. And when you talk about merging data, there's actually two ways you can think about this. So you can think about either merging data with its rows. So let's say, for instance, I had another data set and I wanted to put it at the bottom of this one. So maybe, I have another one that has the same, some of the same columns, and I wanted to simply add it to the bottom here. That would actually be considered what's called a row bind. So you're adding those rows to the bottom of these existing rows. But let's say, for instance, that you actually have other data that you want to put over here on this right side. So let's say, for instance, maybe you had other data for John Smith, Jane, and John Adams, and you had maybe something like, whether or not they like to code or something like that, and you want to actually add columns here to the right. So that would be what's called a column bind. So we would be merging those two data sets column-wise. So both of them are common, but what I want to do in today's video is specifically go over column column-wise merging or column binding. So we won't be talking about the row in this one. We'll be talking about the column merge. Okay. So the basic way to do this is to use what's known as the merge function. And like many things in R, there's multiple ways to do this this combination here, this combo. But merge is the one that I'll be using. So again, I'm sorry if it's a little cut off here, but as usual, if you want more information on a function, you can get that information with the question mark. Okay, so let me show you a more tangible example with some data here. Let's just clear this out and let's look at some data. All right, so we've been working with, let's actually click over here. Okay, so we've been working with a simple data set like this, just 3 columns and 3 basic rows. But let's say, for instance, let's open up that other file. Additional data. Here we go. Let's say we have something like this. So we have the unique ID for these people, but we also have additional columns, additional fields. So we want to bring in their age, and then we also want to bring in whether or not they enjoy coding. So what we'll use is, again, the merge function. And we will create a new object here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to read in that second data set. So I'll call it second data set, and then we'll read it in. And let's get the name of that data file. It was named additional data. Okay, so let's just take a peek here, and we can see that we have that new data for those people. We have their age, and we also have enjoys coding. So what we want to be doing in this example is we want to um, combine their data based off of this unique value. So you can see that in this case, unique ID is common to both of these data sets, but these columns are not. So we want to bring in those new columns and get them merged in. So obviously, I mean, this is a really small data set. You could do this by hand very easily, but of course, this is just for example purposes. If we have a huge data set, combining something by hand would be quite tedious. So just just iterate here that we're using a very simple data set. Okay. So if we want to create a new object here, and I'll call it something like merge dataset, and then we'll use the merge function as I mentioned. And then there's multiple arguments here. I'm just going to go ahead and type them in. So the first argument you want to give it is one of the data sets, and we'll specify that with x. And then that will be example data. So that's the first data set. And then y will be the second one. And then an important argument is by. So by is the column that is shared by both of the data sets. In this case, it's unique ID that I want to be merging on. And they are, in fact, spelled exactly the same, and they are the same. But if for whatever reason you had your two columns named differently, you could also get around that as well. But in this, for simplicity, we'll just work with these two that have the same name. And we'll specify the column that they both share, that they will be merged on. And then I'm going to give it another argument here, all of x. So basically what this is saying is the x data set is the example data, that first one that we've been working with for a while. And then we want to merge in the second one. And then we want to get all of the rows associated with x, regardless if they do not show up in the second one. Of course, again, in this example, they all do, but let's say, for instance, this row wasn't here, and we only had these first two rows. So what would happen is we would actually still get all three of these rows, and then the top two would get data because they're merged in, but there was nothing on the bottom. But we'd still get this third row because we'd get all of x. So that's kind of basically what's happening there. Sorry if I'm going through this a bit quickly, but I know I'm time sensitive here. So I'm already in 24 minutes in, so let's try to wrap things up. So if we merge these two data files, we'll execute that, and let's just take a peek. Great. So now we have that additional data set. So just to recap, so we have just this first row, or these first data set here that just had these three columns, aside from the unique ID, of course. Then we had the second data set. We had the age, and then we had enjoys coding. And now they are in fact merged based off of their unique ID. So as I mentioned, this is a very easy example because the data is so small, but once you get a lot more, this merging by hand would be quite tedious, as I've probably already mentioned. But merge is a great way to combine your data, and it's very fast. So if you've worked with Excel before, then chances are that you've used a function called VLOOKUP to merge your data sets, and this is, I would say, just by far way superior compared to a VLOOKUP because you can bring in multiple columns easily and it's super fast. So this is a really great feature when you want to merge your two data sets by column. Okay, um, let's see where we are. Uh, Time. Okay, last thing real quick. Let's export this data file because we want to make sure that's included. All right, so we've already read in data, but let's actually export stuff so that we want to kind of enjoy you know, the the work that we've done and then actually get that into a working file. So instead of the read.csv, let's try see if there's a write.csv. And of course there is. So as always, if it's a new function and you're trying to learn about it, that question mark helps. And again, I know this is kind of a bit cramped here, but you can read on that stuff on your own if you like. But basically, it's going to take very simply two arguments here that we need. So the first argument is simply the name of the object that we want to export. So in this case, I want to export this. And as I've mentioned, it's good practice to specify the exact argument that you have, just so that you can easily track it later on. Okay, and then the file, the second argument here is the name that we want to call it. So merged, I want to call it merge data file, and then I'll put in by unique ID just for funsies. But then of course we want to include the extension CSV at the end so that we know that this is in fact the CSV file. Okay, great. So it looks like it went through. Let me try and open up that destination on my browser or my Windows Explorer here. Okay. This PC. And it is in data stuff. R and I did put it in here, correct? Oh, okay. Sorry, I have the commas or the question mark still here. Okay, let's try to run this again. Okay, great. So now we have that new file in here. And boom, we have it. You do notice though that we do have some quotes here. So let's see if we can get rid of that. That is, I believe, quote is an argument that we can give that. So let's try giving false and seeing what happens there. Yes, great. Boom. So we got rid of all those quotes. But one thing you do see is that we have these extra row names here. So we'll actually try to get rid of those too. So again, sorry if I'm going through this quickly, but I know we are short on time. It goes false. Okay. Just clear this just so that we can see that. Okay. We open this again. Yes, it's been changed and boom. So those row names have been gone. And now we have our perfectly merged data set. All right, folks, that is going to conclude this fourth lesson. So as I mentioned, we would be reviewing these three topics, some basics of indexing, merging data, and then exporting an object. Of course, we talked about merging data column-wise. We can also cover merging data row-wise in a future video. And they can also spend probably a good amount more on subsetting if we wanted to, but I try to keep this within a reasonable time frame. All right, so thank you so much, folks, for joining in. I hope you join in on our 5th video series, and I hope to see